Welcome to a special episode of CJI Unpacked. This year, CJI is celebrating 20 years since its first report was published, and we're marking that important milestone by collecting some thoughts from leaders about what they think of CJI and how it has helped improve the criminal justice system in Northern Ireland. So I'm delighted to welcome the Minister of Justice, Naomi Long MLA, and really appreciate you taking the time to be with us.
Really pleased to be here.
So can I ask you, in your time, and I know we're thankful that you have returned as Minister of Justice, but what value do you think CJI has added to improving the criminal justice system?
Well, I suppose there are a couple of things. I mean, first and foremost, I think it's really important for public confidence in the justice system that they know that whilst there are lots of independent pieces of the justice system, they're not unaccountable. So not all of them are accountable to me as Justice Minister, and that sometimes frustrates the Assembly. Some of them are accountable through policing board and other things, but having that accountability is really important. Knowing that somebody will go in and look unannounced and just have a look and say what's happening here, are we functioning the way we should be, is really important. The other thing is that as Minister, as you know, I've also called on you when I have had concerns. So, for example, when I was getting a number of complaints around the current supervision units in the prisons and it was becoming a bit of an issue, I thought it was really important. It wasn't that I didn't believe my officials and I didn't trust their judgment, but I thought it was important to have it independently verified what was happening in those current supervision units. And also sometimes when you work in an environment, you become accustomed to it, and having fresh eyes in that environment, but with the experience of understanding the wider justice system, understanding the prison system, to be able to go in and look and say, okay, some of this isn't working as you would have intended, some of it could be improved, has been really helpful. It also was really useful then to be able to share that with MLAs who were concerned about the issue, because it gave them that added layer of assurance that there were issues, they were being addressed. And I think even the fact that when you go back and you do a return report and you look at have things improved, it just reminds people that even though something might have fallen off their agenda, somebody is still coming back and checking that it's happening. And that's an incentive, I think, to keep the criminal justice system generally progressing, focused on change, focused on improvement. And I think just that accountability is really important for us as MLAs, for me as a minister, but also I think for the public in terms of having confidence.
So prison inspections would tend to get a lot of profile, and obviously there's particular issues with inspecting in prisons and in our role as a national preventive mechanism member. But are there other particular areas of the criminal justice system where you think that they need more or less inspection?
Well, I think prisons are the obvious one because it's such a unique environment. You're dealing with such complex needs within the prison system. You're dealing with a whole kind of cadre of people who have different reasons for offending, different challenges while they're in the prison system. There's so much going on there in terms of caring for the prisoners, ensuring that they're well looked after and well accommodated, but then also handling all of the rehabilitation piece. And all of that is very challenging, particularly given resources. But I think in terms of other parts, I mean, the work, for example, that's been done recently around kind of community safety has been really important, because sometimes people forget about community safety and the community safety partnerships, the strong role that they can play in terms of tackling issues, in terms of being able to help the police prioritise resources at a time when resources are scarce. And so I think some of those bits of the system that perhaps don't get the same level of public attention as prisons, but nevertheless are crucial to how safe people feel within their community, and how responsive the police can be to the concerns and needs of neighbourhoods. I think that those reports are actually just as important, because it raises the profile of those issues, but it also, within organisations, makes everybody else reassess their priorities too. You know, are we doing enough to ensure that the strategies are in place, that we have implementation plans around community safety? Have we refreshed what our expectations are? Are we working closely enough with the police and the community and how those are developed? Are there things that the community safety partnerships themselves could be doing more proactively in terms of engaging with communities and so on? So I think just by challenging people, when it's an odd process, but in some ways when people know they're going to be inspected and their work's going to be checked, it's an incentive to want to look back at themselves self-reflectively and sometimes when you're busy, you don't do that so much, but knowing that there's going to be an inspection report means that you have that outside set of eyes, but also it's encouraging you to go, well, are we doing as much as we could? Are there things we could do differently and better? And are there areas where we're not doing what we'd hoped we were doing? And what are the reasons for that? Because sometimes it's not lack of energy or effort. Sometimes people pick the wrong objectives at the start. They've maybe not focused on the right things, or particularly at the minute, they're really challenged around resources, and that can be really difficult. So being able to articulate what the issues are and what the challenges are, I think is really important.
Yeah, I think criminal justice system is obviously, and criminal justice inspectorate is obviously focused on the criminal justice system, but I think sometimes people forget that the department's remit is much wider than that. And you've lots of civil and family justice areas that actually can touch upon criminal justice systems. So in terms of your priorities for the rest of your mandate, is there anything in particular you think that CJI could assist with?
Well, I suppose one of the areas we're looking at, as always, is how to speed up the justice system. And part of that is speeding it up without losing the efficacy of what we do. We want to speed it up, but we don't want it to be slapdash. We want the accuracy and the validity of conviction still to be there, the confidence to still be there. But we need to look at how we use our resource in the best way possible. And that's a piece of work that's going on at the minute within the Criminal Justice Board. There are other areas, I suppose, where, I'm particularly interested in how we modernise the justice system. We've also got a challenge around our prisons, just in terms of the estate and how little capacity we have left at the moment. And that is a priority not of our choosing. It's one that comes to us because I guess we're a demand-led service and we don't have the controls over the demand. And one of the big challenges, I think, for me in this term is to try to look, we've done a lot of transformation within justice and we'll continue to press on that, but it's to look to other departments to say, look, we are in some ways the provider of last resort. So when people have fallen through the net, whether it's mental health, whether it's addiction services, whether it's education, statement and all those things, they're much more likely to end up in the justice system. We know there's a concentration of people with speech and language problems in the justice system, 60% versus 10% in the wider population. We might not be able to change the upstream environment, but we can provide them with really useful data and information as to where they should be targeting their resources, which would reduce our demand. So I think there are things in that space about how we link up with health, how we link up with education, how we link up with communities, how we ensure that we don't just look at people coming through the system and going through the prison system and out the other end. We look at people who come very close to the system and how do we ensure that the diversions that are in place for them, fewer short sentences, more community-based sentencing, how we make sure all that works. Because I actually think prison is not the best place for everybody. It's necessary for some people. But if we can speed up justice and have people serve out their sentence in the community where they can make reparation for their behaviour and maybe find in that rehabilitative process a better way forward for their own lives, that's sometimes much more effective than a short stint in prison. And so I think around that rehabilitation piece in the community and probation, all of those are really important pieces, because prison is not the be all and end all in the justice system. It really should be the place of last resort. And I would like to see more joined up thinking around how we ensure that we don't have people in prison who don't need to be there, who could be better managed if they had health support, addiction support, housing support in the community, and could serve out their sentence there and actually make a constructive contribution.
Mm-hmm. So over the last 20 years, CJI has a history of collaborative inspections. So whether that's with RQI or ETI or inspectorates from England and Wales. So have you any views on how important that collective oversight is?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important. Increasingly, the people, for example, within the prison system have much more complex needs than would have been the case even 20 years ago. Also much better understood. I think we're much more trauma informed in understanding why people end up in prison, in understanding adverse childhood experiences that can lead to offending behaviour. Many people who, for example, are domestic abusers have been abused in their domestic setting themselves. And so we're much better at understanding that, but sometimes not much better at responding to it in the way we would want to. And much of the healthcare, for example, within prison, so if you're dealing with people who have complex mental health needs, is provided by the health service rather than the prison service. I think that's important, but I think having some way joined up to look and say, is the system as a whole working for that person? Because it's not two people, one that the prison service care for and one that the health service care for. What health do in prisons really affects people's behaviour within the prison system, their ability to access education within the prisons and all of those things. So I think those joined up inspections are really useful because they give a whole person perspective. And I suppose what we're trying to do, although we're doing it with different agencies, we're trying to take the individual and assess their needs when they come into the prison system, and then look at how we can assist them to do a transformation as they go through the system and back out into the community. And we can only do that if it's properly joined up. And it's been useful, for example, you've been able to highlight some of the issues, for example, with medication and the fact that medication, we know legal medication that's prescribed to prisoners is then often either taken or traded within the prison system. That's an issue that we then need to go and talk to the trust about how we manage that better. Issues around just how we manage things like addiction services within prison, even simple things or relatively simple things in the community like personal care. How you manage that in an ageing prison population is challenging. So I think the involvement of RQIA, ETI in terms of quality assurance, the education offer that we have, I think all of that's absolutely vital because we know that prisons work best when people are usefully engaged in productive activity where they're getting an education and where they know that there's a pathway beyond prison when they come out. Increasingly now we're working with the housing executive to look at how we can do earlier intervention around where people will be housed when they come out, even if it's going to be temporary accommodation, to know what that temporary accommodation is before somebody leaves prison is a stabilising influence. And we know that those first few days and weeks tend to be the decisive ones in whether people reoffend or not. And so if we can get those first few days and weeks right, that bodes well for everybody. And I think those joint inspections are a big part of ensuring that it's all properly joined up and that it's a cohesive offer when we're actually trying to look after people.
So finally, Minister, it's hard to look sometimes 2 years ahead, never mind 20 years ahead. But in terms of your ambitions for the rest of this mandate, is there anything you can share with us about where you see things coming forward?
Yeah, I mean, one of our biggest challenges, I guess, in this mandate will be finances, and that will be a limiting factor, I think, for every part of the justice system, yourselves included. And I mean, we've obviously had a really candid conversation about that. I mean, I've been talking to Public Prosecution Service, and whilst they're not within my remit, you know, I've said to them, like, I'm happy to go back in the bat for the entire justice system because we don't want the justice system to get a bit more money and then find PPS are overloaded. So we've got to get this right across the board. So finance is going to be the big limiting factor, but I think there are still things we can do. We had a lot of legislation in that first 2-year period when I was minister, and I think we now need to let that bed in. But also you mentioned civil and family courts. We need to look at whether the work we've done around domestic abuse is feeding through as we would have hoped into the family courts. Is it being acknowledged if somebody is a domestic abuser that might be the reason for anxiety around parental rights and all of those things? And I know that Jerry Hanna, as Victims Commissioner, is looking very carefully at that. But that's another area I think we need to be sensitive to. The decisions we make around criminal justice can often impact then on the family courts. The other areas for me is about bedding those in and ensure that they're working as we'd anticipated and intended. And then I suppose the other things that I'm looking forward, there's modernisation of justice, which we're taking forward. There is a sentencing bill, which we're hoping will come forward in this mandate. And that's looking at issues that have really impacted on people in terms of what are the maximum sentences for certain categories of offending so that judges maintain their discretion, but that they're not limited by the upper thresholds that are there at the moment. And we're looking at how we can do that. And also taking account of emerging areas, I suppose. We're getting a lot of complaint from people working in public service in the front line about abuse and violence being meted out to them in the last few years. It seems to have escalated. So we were originally looking at some legislation around people working in emergency services. We're now looking at expanding that potentially out to other frontline workers. And then the third and probably the most thorny one will be around hate crime and how we define hate crime in law, how we prosecute it better. And obviously Judge Marinen's report is one of the ones that will influence that. So those are the three big ticket legislative pieces. But in terms of other work we're doing, I think it is about trying to maintain that forward momentum in terms of the quality of service that we provide in what is a really challenging financial situation. And obviously being able to present to the Department of Finance kind of coherent information that shows that if you underfund the service, we cannot provide the level of service that people would expect. I think having that robustness of approach is really important for us in the next couple of years. But I remain optimistic despite the challenges. I think we have brilliant people in the justice system, working in the justice system. They're often not here because they're well paid, but because they're really committed. And we shouldn't take them for granted, but equally we should be very grateful that they are as committed as they are and as passionate about their work as they are. And I think that that's the biggest asset any sector can have, is a committed workforce and people who are passionate about their jobs. And I see that in everything from probation to prisons, from policing right through. And I see it in the care and attention to detail that you take with your inspections, because there is genuine concern and interest for the welfare, not just of prisoners, but prison officers, for the staff, for the people who are working in the system, and all of that matters. So I think it's a really important way of bringing the system together and looking at whether the whole system is operating as we'd hoped. And for me, it's a really valuable tool in measuring how much progress we're actually making.
Thank you, Minister. I think it's important, certainly important to the CJI team and to myself, that we're able to provide that assurance and to be able to highlight where there is good practice, as well as making recommendations for improvement. And obviously in a tight funding environment, it's important that resources are used well. It's not just about more, it's about better. So thank you so much for taking time with us today. You can find out some more information on the CJI website, and we look forward to the next edition of CJI Unpacked.